The first country to break may not be the country that matters most. That is the uncomfortable truth most people miss when they hear a countdown like this. They want one clean answer: which country falls first, which government runs out of money first, which currency collapses first. But financial history does not work that neatly. A small country can crack first and be dismissed as a local problem. Then another cracks and people call it coincidence. Then a major economy shows the same pattern, and suddenly everyone realizes the problem was never local. It was structural. 7 countries are now flashing different versions of the same warning. Some are poor, some are rich, some are emerging markets, some are advanced economies. Some have already suffered collapse. Some have postponed it with domestic savings, institutions, and reserve currency privilege. But the pattern is the same: rising debt, shrinking room, weakening currencies, political pressure, and governments that prefer delay because delay is easier to sell than discipline. That is the beginning of the debt cycle. A sovereign debt crisis is not just something that happens in a finance ministry. It happens at the grocery store. It happens at the fuel pump. It happens in rent, medicine, school fees, and wages that no longer keep up when the government cannot manage debt. Honestly, the currency becomes the shock absorber. And when the currency absorbs the shock, citizens pay. There are 3 signals worth watching: debt above 90% of GDP, reserves below roughly 3 months of imports, and the most dangerous signal of all, politicians taking control of money and asking central banks to print, suppress rates, or pretend there is no bill. When all 3 appear, the clock starts running. Bangladesh is the first warning. Bangladesh is not a failure story. That is why it is important. For 2 decades, it looked like one of the clearest development successes in the world. Millions escaped poverty. Garment exports grew. Western brands depended on its factories. GDP growth looked strong. Then 3 shocks arrived together. The pandemic damaged exports, energy prices doubled the cost of imported fuel. The stronger dollar made dollar debts and import bills heavier. Foreign exchange reserves fell from around $46 billion to under $21 billion in about 18 months. Power rationing followed. Factories lost production hours. The country still had relatively low debt, but its emergency dollar cushion was shrinking fast. That is the lesson. A country does not need to be drowning in debt to become fragile. If it relies on imported energy and foreign demand, reserve depletion can become the first crack. Egypt is the second warning. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, imports most of its wheat, and supports more than 100 million people in a country where bread is not just food, it is political stability. Debt has crossed the 90% threshold. The pound has fallen. Food and energy shocks have made imports more expensive. IMF loans have kept the system breathing, but every rescue repeats the same formula: cut subsidies, devalue, tighten, and hope the population can absorb the pain. That is the problem. Creditors want discipline. Citizens need relief. The budget cannot satisfy both forever. Egypt's danger is not one number. It is the collision of food dependence, currency weakness, high debt, and political pressure. When a government must choose between paying creditors and protecting bread prices, finance becomes politics, and politics can destroy discipline quickly. Pakistan is where the crisis becomes visible. Pakistan has gone to the IMF more than 20 times. That is not bad luck. That is a system that keeps producing the same emergency. In 2023, reserves fell so low that the country had only weeks of import coverage for a nation of more than 200 million people, dependent on imported fuel and outside financing. That is not a warning light. That is the dashboard on fire. The energy trap makes it worse. Pakistan needs imported fuel to keep electricity running. When fuel prices rise, the government can either pass the pain to citizens or borrow to subsidize it. Borrowing looks easier today. It becomes more expensive tomorrow. Now, interest payments consume an enormous share of government revenue. Money that should build the future is used to pay for the past. The country needs investment to reduce dependency, but debt service consumes the money that could fund that investment. That is the trap. It tightens with every cycle. Turkey proves how fast credibility can die. Turkey is a serious economy. It has factories, exporters, banks, entrepreneurs, and strategic importance. But a serious economy can still damage its currency if politics overwhelms monetary reality. Inflation surged. The lira collapsed. Citizens saw savings lose value because leadership tried to fight inflation with policies. Markets did not believe. A currency is confidence made visible. When people believe the central bank is no longer protecting money, they move into dollars, gold, property, and anything outside the local currency. Their private self-defense becomes public pressure on the system. Turkey later tried to repair the damage with higher rates and more orthodox policy. But trust is not rebuilt as quickly as it is lost. A few quarters can break credibility. Years may not fully restore it. That is why Turkey matters here. It is not simply a prediction, it is evidence. Argentina is the memory of what happens after trust is broken repeatedly. Argentina has defaulted again and again. It has lived through inflation, devaluation, frozen deposits, emergency decrees, and public exhaustion. The 2001 crisis showed ordinary people the most brutal lesson of sovereign collapse. Rules can change when governments become desperate. People thought their bank deposits were safe, then accounts were frozen, conversion terms changed. Real purchasing power disappeared, not through a market they chose to enter, but through a government decision they could not avoid. That is what stable societies underestimate. They think money in a bank is always money in a bank. They think the legal form is the same thing as real value. Argentina teaches that under enough pressure, governments protect the system first and savers. Second, Argentina is now attempting radical repair, spending cuts, fiscal surplus, talk of dollarization. It may work, but the scars remain. A government can change policy quickly. A population does not forget betrayal quickly. Japan is the quiet warning from the developed world. Japan looks safe because it is orderly, rich, advanced, and disciplined. But Japan carries debt around 263% of GDP. It survived because most of the debt is held at home. Japanese institutions held Japanese government bonds. The Bank of Japan supported the system. The loop stayed mostly domestic. That gave Japan time that an emerging market would never receive. But time is not the same as escape. When inflation returned, Japan faced the trap. Raise interest rates and debt service becomes dangerous. Keep rates too low and the yen weakens while purchasing power erodes. The government can avoid a sudden break, but it may do so by accepting a long, quiet transfer of wealth away from savers. That is why Japan matters. It shows that a crisis in a rich country may not look like Argentina. It may look like years of weak currency, suppressed returns, and slow erosion. Slow loss is still loss. Then comes the country almost no one wants to name. The United States. America is not near a sudden collapse. That must be said clearly. It has the reserve currency, deep capital markets, enormous productive capacity, the most powerful military, and a culture that steadily creates businesses bigger than almost anything, but none of that repeals arithmetic. The United States now spends more on interest on the national debt than on national defense. Debt to GDP is above 120%. Deficits remain huge, even outside a depression or a world war. Long-term projections point toward much higher debt. America can do what others cannot because the dollar is the center of the global system. The world needs dollars. The world buys treasuries. The world runs toward America in moments of fear. That is the privilege. But it is also the temptation because America can borrow longer. It delays longer because demand for dollars is deep. Discipline becomes easier to postpone because the world still trusts the system. Politicians assume that trust has no limit. History says trust always has a limit. A reserve currency country usually does not default by missing payments. It defaults quietly. Through inflation and reduced purchasing power, you receive your dollars. The question is what those dollars buy. That is why the American risk is not dramatic in the way Pakistan. S risk is dramatic. It is slower, larger, and more global. If Pakistan breaks, the tragedy is severe. If America weakens over time, every portfolio, pension, central bank reserve, trade contract, and savings account connected to the dollar feels it. So which country falls first? If the question means the first obvious crisis, look at Pakistan and Egypt. They have weak reserves, high import dependence, IMF reliance, and political pressure. Bangladesh is earlier in the sequence, but worth watching because the reserve trend is dangerous. Turkey and Argentina have already shown the mechanism. Turkey showed how credibility dies. Argentina showed how the rules change when a government is cornered. Japan and the United States are different. They are not likely to be the first visible failures. They are more important because they sit near the center of the system. Weakness there does not stay local. This is the real point. The world is not facing 7 unrelated country stories. It is facing one debt mechanism appearing in 7 forms in Bangladesh. It appears as reserve depletion. In Egypt, food and currency pressure. In Pakistan, IMF dependency and energy debt. In Turkey, broken monetary credibility. In Argentina, repeated default memory. In Japan, a debt loop supported by domestic savings. In America, the burden of interest colliding with reserve currency privilege. Different countries, same machine. When governments borrow too much and postpone too long, the bill does not vanish. It changes form. Sometimes it becomes inflation. sometimes default, sometimes currency collapse, sometimes frozen savings, sometimes higher taxes, sometimes lower real wages for years, but it always lands somewhere. The smart response is not panic. Panic is for people who waited too long. The smart response is preparation. Preparation means not trusting one currency blindly, not assuming every government promise is equal to real purchasing power, not mistaking nominal safety for real safety, not believing that because something has never happened in your lifetime. It cannot happen. The next crisis may start at the edge, but the most important damage may come from the center. That is the part most people will understand too late. By the time everyone agrees that the pattern was obvious, the pattern will already be inside prices, wages, savings, pensions, and the purchasing power of the money people spent their lives trying to protect.